These are 20 hidden facts about Trackdown, the 1957 television series that almost nobody talks about, even though it launched Steve McQueen's entire career, gave Sam Peckinpah his first real creative foothold in Hollywood, put Richard Donner behind a directing camera for the very first time, and aired an episode so eerily connected to modern politics that it went viral on the internet nearly 60 years after it was first broadcast. Before we get into the facts, there's something you need to know up front, because the internet has been getting this wrong for a long time now. A lot of websites and film databases list something called Trackdown 1957 as if it were a standalone theatrical western, the kind you would have caught at a drive-in double bill on a Friday night, and the truth is that no such film exists. What does exist, what actually aired in 1957, is a CBS television series, and not just any television series, a series dense with hidden connections, legendary guest stars, accidental political prophecy, and career-defining moments for some of Hollywood's biggest names, all of it hiding in plain sight for decades because of one stubborn database error that nobody bothered to correct. Something this loaded with history deserves to be known for what it actually was, and once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why it stayed buried for so long. So let's set the record straight and count down the 20 facts that make Trackdown one of the most overlooked pieces of American television history. Fact number 1. Trackdown was a CBS television series, not a film. Entertainment history gets mislabeled more often than most people realize, and once a wrong label spreads across enough platforms, people stop questioning it. That's exactly what happened with Trackdown. Certain film databases, including a listing on the platform PewBuy, cataloged Trackdown 1957 as a standalone film, with a synopsis describing a Texas Ranger traveling the Old West, tracking down killers, bank robbers, horse thieves, and other assorted criminals. The description of the content is accurate. The format label is completely wrong. What Trackdown actually was is a 30-minute episodic Western series on CBS, premiering October 4, 1957, shooting 70 episodes plus a pilot, before wrapping in 1959, in black and white on California studio backlots, with no theatrical release, no drive-in circuit, and no film canister anywhere. That persistent misclassification has sent a generation of Western fans in the wrong direction, either confused by the listing or completely unaware that the real series is out there and available to watch. Sit down with the actual show, and what you find is not a forgotten B-Western curiosity, but a series carrying a genuinely astonishing amount of history in its 2 seasons. Fact number 2. The show starred Robert Culp in his defining early role. Robert Culp played Texas Ranger Hobie Gilman across all 70 episodes of the series, and the role arrived at a moment when Culp had been working steadily in television without quite breaking through to the recognition his talent warranted. Trackdown changed that. Hobie Gilman was written as a lawman who thought before he drew, who weighed consequences and operated with a sense of justice that stretched beyond simply putting outlaws down, and Culp brought an understated naturalism to the character that separated the show from the more theatrical cowboys, competing for attention on the same airwaves at the same time. Week after week he held the center of the series while an extraordinary rotation of guest performers orbited around him, and his consistency across 2 full seasons is part of why the show's best episodes hold up today. Culp carried real pride in this work throughout his life, and the performance deserves more credit than it typically receives, amounting to one of the more undervalued leading turns in the history of the genre. Fact number 3. The show was produced by Dick Powell's 4-Star Television. Trackdown didn't emerge from one of the old theatrical studios scrambling to stay relevant in the television era. 4-Star Television, the production company Dick Powell had built into one of the most active operations in early TV, produced the series in partnership with CBS, and Powell himself was one of the savviest executives working in American entertainment at the time. He had already pulled off one of the more improbable career reinventions in Hollywood history, moving from musical comedy actor to tough guy leading man, and by the late 1950s he was channeling that same instinct into building one of the busiest production companies on the West Coast. What that association gave Trackdown was access to a rotating pool of directors, writers, and performers that 4-Star was simultaneously deploying across multiple productions. And that pipeline of working talent is why the show's credits read the way they do. Future legends turning up in episode after episode wasn't coincidence. It was the direct result of operating inside one of television's most connected production operations of the entire era. And 4-Star's infrastructure made the show possible, while the talent that walked through the door made it worth remembering. Fact number 4. The pilot aired on a completely different show. 5 months before Trackdown debuted on CBS as its own series, the pilot episode aired somewhere else entirely. Titled Badge of Honor, it ran on Dick Powell's Zane Grey Theater on May 3, 1957, embedded inside an anthology western that 4-Star used partly as a testing ground for concepts with series potential. Arthur Hiller directed that pilot, the same Arthur Hiller who would later direct Love Story and The In-Laws, and his work here shows a sure directorial hand already developing. The strategy itself tells you something about how television development operated in this era. Networks didn't commit to full series on faith alone. Anthology programs served as incubators, letting concepts prove themselves in front of a live audience before any larger investment was made, and Badge of Honor clearly delivered what was needed. 5 months later, Trackdown had its own Friday night time slot on CBS, and a full season order waiting to be filled. Fact number 5. The series was set in the 1870s post-Civil War Texas. The stories of Hobie Gilman played out in Texas in the 1870s, during the years following the Civil War, when the state was still raw and contested, still being shaped by Reconstruction, frontier expansion, and the slow, difficult work of establishing law in places where lawlessness had been the accepted default for a long time. This wasn't the timeless mythologized West that most contemporary Westerns preferred, where the setting functioned as a backdrop for adventure rather than a world with its own specific history and fault lines. Placing the show in this post-war moment opened room for stories with genuine moral complexity, stories about justice, community failure, civic cowardice, corruption, and the fragility of order in a place where nobody could take it for granted. There was something honest about the choice, too, an acknowledgement that the world these settlers were building was imperfect and contested and built on difficult ground. That seriousness drew writers like Sam Peckinpah to contribute to the series, and it's why the best episodes still carry weight today, decades removed from the culture that produced them. Fact number 6. The Texas Rangers and the state of Texas officially endorsed the show. No other Western on American television ever earned this, and as far as the record shows, none has since. Trackdown carried the official endorsement of both the state of Texas and the Texas Rangers, not as a line on the promotional poster, but as a genuine institutional stamp of approval from the organization whose history the show was dramatizing. The Rangers had reviewed how they were being portrayed and decided the show honored rather than exploited their legacy, and that wasn't a decision they handed out freely or made without scrutiny. For a genre that had spent decades taking liberties with frontier law enforcement, this level of institutional backing was genuinely unusual, and it says something specific about how the producers and writers approached the material. The Rangers didn't endorse shows that treated them as window dressing. Getting that approval required the creative team to take seriously their obligation to the real history behind the fiction, and by every available account, they did exactly that. Fact number 7. Robert Culp called it the Western Dragnet. 3 words, and they tell you almost everything you need to know about what this show was actually reaching for. Culp called Trackdown the Western Dragnet, and once you hear that description, the entire shape of the series snaps into focus. Dragnet had redefined crime drama in the early 1950s through its semi-documentary style, its use of actual LAPD case files as story material, its tight procedural dialogue, and its refusal to trade in melodrama when plainness would do the job better. Culp's framing signals that Trackdown was chasing that same quality of grounded procedural authenticity, just transposed from the streets of mid-century Los Angeles onto the Texas frontier of the 1870s. The description also reveals something about how Culp understood his own work on the series. He wasn't treating the show as disposable Friday night filler, something to collect a check on and move past. He understood it as procedural drama with a specific creative ambition, and that understanding shows in the kind of performance he gave across 2 full seasons. Fact number 8. Some episodes were inspired by actual Texas Rangers case files. The procedural ambition Culp described wasn't just a posture the show struck for credibility. At least some of Trackdown's episodes drew directly from documented case files belonging to the real Texas Rangers, which mirrors exactly what Dragnet did with LAPD records, and also explains, more clearly than anything else, why the Rangers chose to officially endorse the series in the first place. Drawing from real investigative records comes with an obligation to handle them accurately, and the fact that the Rangers sanctioned this use of their institutional history suggests the creative team delivered on that obligation rather than just claiming to. Buried inside the show's 70-episode run are dramatizations of real events from Texas law enforcement history, stories built not only from a screenwriter's imagination, but from actual documented cases. Few Western series ever made that claim with any credibility. This one could back it up. Fact number 9. The series archives are held at a major university. The Trackdown television series archives live at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin, and that detail is worth sitting with for a moment. A late 1950s black and white TV Western left behind production records that a major academic research institution dedicated to the history of American civilization decided were worth preserving and cataloging. The Briscoe Center holds collections covering Texas politics, journalism, and culture, and the presence of the Trackdown archives inside that institution reflects the show's genuine connection to real Texas history and to the Rangers specifically. Most Western series from this era left nothing comparable behind. Trackdown left primary source material, scripts, correspondence, production documents, available to anyone who wants to understand how the series was made and what it meant inside the culture that produced it. And if that surprised you, that a 1950s TV Western left behind university-level archives, then hit subscribe right now, because we are barely halfway through, and what's coming next is even more extraordinary. Fact number 10. The show filmed at Republic Studios and DeSalo Culver. Two of Hollywood's most historically loaded production facilities provided the physical world of Trackdown. Primary filming happened at Republic Studios, at 4024 Radford Avenue in North Hollywood, the longtime home of B-Western production where Roy Rogers and Gene Autry had built their biggest careers, and where Saturday matinee westerns had been manufactured for a generation of American kids who grew up accepting that version of the frontier as gospel. Republic was deep in transition by the late 1950s, its theatrical output shrinking as the television era accelerated, but its backlots and standing western sets were exactly what a weekly CBS series needed to keep production moving on schedule. The show also worked out of DeSalo Culver, the facility that Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz had turned into one of the busiest television production centers in the country. Together, these two locations placed Trackdown inside the beating heart of mid-century Hollywood, surrounded by the machinery and the people who were simultaneously building the genre's greatest era. Fact number 11. The series was sponsored by Lucky Strike and Mobil. Television sponsorship in the 1950s worked nothing like today's advertising model. Sponsors didn't buy scattered 30-second slots throughout a broadcast. They underwrote entire programs, with their names and brands woven directly into the shows themselves, and Trackdown's backers were the American Tobacco Company, makers of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and Mobil, the oil and energy company. Lucky Strike's investment in Western programming wasn't unusual for the era. The cigarette industry ranked among the most aggressive television advertisers of the 1950s, and Westerns attracted exactly the audience those advertisers wanted to reach. Mobil's presence reflects the enormous post-war American appetite for automobiles and fuel, and the cultural equation that linked the mythology of the open frontier to the open road and everything it promised. Both companies funded the show's weekly production and carried it into millions of American living rooms, which is a reminder that the stories airing on screen were always being delivered through the commercial structures of the world surrounding them. Fact number 12. Steve McQueen's entire career was launched by one episode, March 7, 1958. Steve McQueen appeared in the 21st episode of Trackdown's first season, in an installment titled The Bounty Hunter, playing Josh Randall, a bounty hunter working the frontier, and what came through the screen was the kind of coiled, magnetic stillness that would eventually make him one of the most bankable performers on the planet. Don McDougall directed the episode, John Robinson wrote it, and producer Vincent Fennelly recognized immediately that he was watching something worth building around. Fennelly began pushing for a spin-off series built entirely on the Josh Randall character, and that spin-off became Wanted Dead or Alive, premiering on CBS on September 6, 1958, just 6 months after McQueen first stepped onto the Trackdown set. Wanted Dead or Alive ran 94 episodes across 3 seasons, and after that McQueen never worked as a struggling character actor again. Fact number 13. Dick Powell didn't want Steve McQueen on the show. The path that put McQueen in front of Trackdown's cameras was not smooth, and the opposition came from inside the building. Dick Powell, head of 4-Star Television and among the most powerful figures attached to the production, didn't want McQueen. The objections were specific. McQueen was too short for a Western leading man, and his inability to ride horses convincingly was a legitimate professional concern for a genre where those qualities counted as baseline requirements. None of that was wrong exactly, but Vincent Fennelly read the situation differently. What drew Fennelly to McQueen wasn't physical stature or riding skill. It was the vulnerability and sensitivity underneath the toughness, the quality that made him feel dangerous and genuinely human at the same time. Fennelly pushed for McQueen over his own boss's direct objections, won that argument, and the result was one of the most consequential casting decisions in the history of American television. Powell's instincts weren't unreasonable. Fennelly's were just better. Fact number 14. McQueen appeared in a second episode of Trackdown. The bounty hunter wasn't the only time McQueen showed up in the series. He returned for a second episode, The Brothers, airing May 16, 1958, about 10 weeks after his debut, at a point when the machinery behind Wanted Dead or Alive was still being assembled and pitched at the network level. That second appearance reflected how television in this era actually developed its talent, not through massive pilot commitments and instant greenlit series, but through careful, incremental exposure that allowed audiences to attach to a character and a performer before the network committed to anything larger or more expensive. Taken together, McQueen's 2 Trackdown appearances amounted to a 2-part audition for one of the most consequential career launches in television history. And both times, he gave them exactly what was needed. Fact number 15. McQueen earned $750 per episode on his own series. When Wanted Dead or Alive launched on CBS, McQueen's rate for the new show was $750 per episode. That number gives a precise sense of what a rising television actor could command in the late 1950s, before film offers started arriving in volume, before the name Steve McQueen carried the commercial weight it would eventually hold. $750 per episode was a working professional's wage, not a signal that anyone in the room had fully understood what they were looking at. McQueen would go on to become one of the highest-paid performers in the entertainment business, but the road from that first Trackdown appearance to the early weeks of his own series ran through a salary that today looks almost startlingly modest against the scale of the career it helped set in motion. If the Steve McQueen connection to this 1957 TV series just hit the way we think it should, drop a comment below telling us which of these facts surprised you the most. It tells us what to dig into next, and the conversations that happen in these comment sections are one of our favorite parts of making these videos. Fact number 16. Sam Peckinpah wrote an episode for the series, before The Wild Bunch, before Straw Dogs, before Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Sam Peckinpah was a television writer looking for rooms that would take his work. One of those rooms was Trackdown. Peckinpah wrote the episode The Town, airing December 13, 1957, less than 3 months into the show's first season, with Lee Van Cleef and Stuart Whitman in the cast. The story follows an outlaw gang descending on a small community, whose residents are too frightened and too divided to mount any meaningful resistance, and the themes running through it, cowardice, collective failure, the catastrophic cost of ordinary people refusing to confront extraordinary violence when it arrives in their midst, are unmistakably his. Those same ideas run through some of the most celebrated films he would make in the 2 decades that followed. The Town isn't simply an old television episode in a long-forgotten series. It's an early document of one of cinema's great creative voices finding its shape inside the format available to it at the time, and it belongs on any serious accounting of Peckinpah's formative work. Fact number 17. Richard Donner launched his directing career on Trackdown. Peckinpah wasn't the only future cinematic name who used Trackdown as a professional starting point. Richard Donner, who would eventually direct Superman, The Omen and the Lethal Weapon franchise, began his professional directing career on the series in 1957, at a point when he was young, largely unknown, and working in a television environment that was expanding faster than the industry could easily manage. And that's where the opportunity came from. The sheer volume of programming the networks needed during the Western boom created openings for young directors to accumulate real experience at a pace that would have been impossible inside the more hierarchical and controlled world of theatrical film production. Trackdown and shows like it required fast decisions, under the constant pressure of tight schedules and budgets that left no room for hesitation, and Donner learned his craft inside exactly that pressure. The skills that later served him on vastly larger stages, communicating quickly with actors, solving problems without stopping production, keeping control of a set, all of it started developing here, in 1957, on a CBS Western about a Texas Ranger. Fact number 18. The guest star roster is extraordinary. Beyond Peckinpah, Donner, and McQueen, the list of people who passed through Trackdown across 2 seasons reads like a preview of careers that hadn't fully happened yet. Michael Landon appeared before Bonanza made him a household name across America. James Coburn guest starred years before the Academy Award and the defining action films of the 1960s and 70s. Warren Oates showed up long before he became one of the new Hollywood era's most respected and distinctive performers. Rita Moreno was a guest performer before her Academy Award for West Side Story. DeForest Kelley, who would later be immortalized as Dr. Leonard McCoy on Star Trek, appeared in 4 separate episodes across the run of the series. Pernell Roberts, James Drury, Nick Adams, Bobby Driscoll, and Johnny Crawford all made appearances as well. The concentration of future talent inside a single series is hard to write off as coincidence. Trackdown was one of those professional environments that happened to attract an unusual density of people who were quietly on their way to becoming something that would last. Fact number 19. An episode featured a conman named Walter Trump, who wanted to build a wall. Season 1, Episode 30, titled The End of the World, aired May 9, 1958. In it, a conman named Walter Trump, played by Lawrence Dobkin, arrives in a small Texas frontier town and begins spreading fear by warning the citizens of a coming catastrophe that only he can prevent. The price of his protection: building a wall. When residents question his claims and accuse him publicly of dishonesty, Walter Trump threatens to sue them for it, and he is ultimately exposed as a fraud and arrested. That episode sat in the archives for nearly 60 years without anyone paying much attention to it, and then, in late 2016, someone found it. Vanity Fair covered it, The Wrap covered it, the San Francisco Chronicle covered it. Snopes investigated and confirmed the content as real, verifiable, and exactly what it appeared to be: a fictional conman named Walter Trump, demanding a wall, threatening lawsuits, getting arrested as a fraud, all of it broadcast on CBS in May of 1958. The name, the wall, the litigation threats, all confirmed, all waiting there in the record for the world to eventually go looking. Fact number 20. The Western TV boom that birthed Trackdown also consumed it. Trackdown came into existence at the peak of the most extraordinary eruption of Western programming in American television history, and the same forces driving that eruption eventually swept the show away along with dozens of others. The series launched in October of 1957, when new Westerns were debuting almost weekly, with Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel, Wagon Train, Sugarfoot, Tombstone Territory, and Colt 45 all premiering in that same season. By the 1958-59 television year, 7 of the 10 highest-rated programs on American television were Westerns, and by 1959 30 competing Western series were running simultaneously in prime time. And then the audience hit a wall. Networks that had ordered Westerns as fast as they could began canceling them just as fast. Trackdown moved from Fridays at 8 o'clock to Wednesdays in January of 1959. The audience didn't follow in sufficient numbers, and the show was gone not long after. 70 episodes. Steve McQueen launched into stardom. 2 future legends of cinema given their first real professional footing. The only official Texas Rangers endorsement in Western television history. And 1 episode from May of 1958 that sat quietly in a university archive until the world finally gave it a reason to be found. Trackdown. Not a film. Not a mislabeled database entry that someone will eventually clean up. A CBS television series that premiered October 4, 1957, produced by Dick Powell's 4-Star Television, starring Robert Culp as Texas Ranger Hobie Gilman across 70 episodes of black and white frontier drama. The only Western series ever to carry the official endorsement of the state of Texas and the Texas Rangers. A show whose production archives live at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin. A series that took Steve McQueen from a struggling young actor to the most magnetic television presence of his era, over the specific objections of one of the most powerful men in the building. A show that handed Sam Peckinpah the space to develop ideas he would carry into his greatest films. That put Richard Donner behind a camera at the start of what became one of the most commercially successful directing careers in Hollywood history. That brought in Michael Landon, James Coburn, Warren Oates, Rita Moreno, and DeForest Kelley, among many others, before any of them were who they would eventually become. And a series that put a con man named Walter Trump on screen in May of 1958, demanding a wall, threatening lawsuits, and being arrested for fraud, all of it sitting there in the record for 60 years until the world finally had reason to go looking. Trackdown doesn't fit neatly into any simple category, and that's exactly the problem with how it's been treated. Too large in its connections, too strange in its legacy, too unsettlingly prescient to file away as a routine Western and forget. Now you know what it actually was. 20 facts, 2 seasons, 70 episodes, and a story that turned out to be considerably bigger than the genre it was hiding inside.